Chapter 14. Aoyagi and his people had been appalled at the news of Arasaka's rebellion against the emperor. The common people of Nihon-Ja thought of the emperor as a person whose accession to the throne was guided and consecrated by the gods. To rebel against him was an unthinkable sacrilege. "We are your people, Lord Shigeru," the white-haired village elder had said. "Tell us what you want us to do. We'll stand beside you against Arasaka." There had been an indignant rumble of assent from the other villagers. Foremost among them, Horace had noted, had been Aiko, the heavily built worker Shigeru had first shaken hands with. Aoyagi might be the village elder, but Aiko was obviously a person of considerable influence among the younger Kikori. "Thank you, my friends," Shigeru had replied, "but at the moment I hope to avoid further bloodshed. All we need is a guide to the village of—" He had hesitated and looked to Shukin for the name of the village he had nominated as a rendezvous point with Reito and the survivors of the army. "Kawagishi," Shukin had said. "Riverbank village." Aoyagi had bowed. "We know this village," he had said. "My nephew, Mikeru, will show you the way in the morning." Shigeru had bowed from his sitting position. "Thank you, Aoyagi. And now let's have no more talk of this unpleasantness with Arasaka. Let's enjoy the evening. Do any of your people have a folk song for us all to sing?" A hot bath, hot food, dry clothes, and a warm, dry bed for the night worked wonders on Horace's tired body. Shortly after dawn, the emperor and his party woke, breakfasted, and prepared to move out once more. The rain had stopped during the night, and the sky had cleared to a brilliant blue. Horace's breath steamed in the cold air as he exhaled. One of the village women had taken his wet, travel-stained clothes during the night and cleaned and dried them. The same service had been performed for the rest of the travellers. Putting on clean clothes, still warm from the fire they had dried in front of, was a distinct luxury. There was the usual bustle and confusion involved in setting out. The riders inspected their girth straps. Weapons were checked, belts tightened, armour adjusted. As was his habit, Horace had cleaned and sharpened his sword the previous night before he slipped between the warmed bed covers laid out on the matting floor of his room. He guessed that each of the senshi had done the same. As the rest of the party mounted, Shukin held back. He reached into the purse at his belt and produced a handful of golden coins, each stamped with a triple cherry crest. Aoyagi saw the movement and backed away, holding his hands out before him. "No, no, Lord Shukin! We don't want any payment. It was our pleasure to have the Emperor as our guest." Shukin grinned at him. He had expected the reaction, but he knew that times were hard in the mountains, and the Kikori had little to spare. He had his answer ready for Aoyagi's protestation. "The Emperor, perhaps," he said, "but nobody would expect you to provide for a dozen hungry senshi, or for a massive gaijin with the appetite of a black bear." He indicated Horace when he said this, grinning to make sure that Horace knew he was joking. Horace shook his head ruefully. He couldn't dispute the fact that he had eaten more than any of the others in the party. Nihon-Ja helpings seemed so small to him, and he was famous even in Araluen for his prodigious appetite. The villagers laughed. Horace had proved to be a figure of great interest and popularity among the Kikori. He was polite and self-effacing, and ready to join in singing their folk songs, albeit with more enthusiasm than melody. Even Aoyagi smiled. His sense of hospitality made him reluctant to take the money, but he knew that if he didn't, his people would go short. With the gold Shukin was offering, they could buy more supplies at the monthly market held in one of the larger villages. "Well then," he said, capitulating with good grace, "in deference to the Kurokuma." He accepted the coins, and Horace was given the name by which he would be known among the Nihon-Jan, Kurokuma, or Black Bear. At the time, however, he was unaware of it. He was busy fastening a loose strap on the bedroll tied behind his saddle and missed Ayagi's statement. Shukin bowed gracefully, and Ayagi returned the gesture. Then he turned and bowed to the Emperor, with all of the assembled villagers doing the same. "Thank you, Ayagi-san," Shigeru said, raising his hand to them all. "And thank you, Kikori." The villagers remained, heads bowed, as the small party rode out of the village. Mikaru, the elder's nephew, was a keen-faced, slimly built youth of about 16. He rode a small, shaggy-haired pony, the kind the Kikori people used as beasts of burden when they've gathered wood. He was familiar with the area, of course, and led them on a much shorter route than the one shown on the map Shukin carried. They had been travelling for less than an hour when they reached the ford in the river that Shukin had hoped to cross the night before. They rode across in single file, the horses stepping carefully on the slippery stones beneath their hooves. The water rose shoulder-high on the horses, and it was icy cold as it soaked through Horace's leggings and boots. "Glad it's not raining," he muttered, as he rode up the far bank, his horse shaking itself to rid itself of excess water. He wished he could do the same. "What was that, Kurokuma?" asked one of the escort riding near him. The others chuckled at the name. "Nothing important," Horace said. Then he looked at them suspiciously. "What's this Kurokuma business?" The senshi looked at him with a completely straight face. "It's a term of great respect," he said. Several others, within earshot, nodded confirmation. They too managed to remain straight-faced. It was a skill the Nihon-Jan had perfected. "Great respect," one of them echoed. Horace studied them all carefully. Nobody was smiling, but he knew by now that meant nothing with the Nihon-Jan. He sensed there was a joke he was missing, but he couldn't think of a way to find out what it might be. Best maintain his dignity, he thought. "Well, I should think so," he told them, and rode on. Shortly after crossing the river, Mikaru led them to a cleared patch of ground on the side of the trail, set at the edge of a sheer cliff that dropped away into the valley below. This was the lookout Shukin had wanted to reach. He, Shigeru, and Horace dismounted and moved closer to the edge. Horace drew in his breath. The cliff edge was abrupt, as if it had been cut by a knife. The mountain dropped away several thousand meters to a valley. They could see the mountains they had been climbing, and beyond them, the low-lying flatlands. Horace, who never enjoyed the sensation of being in high places, kept his distance from the cliff edge. Shukin and Shigeru had no such qualms. They stood less than a meter from the awful drop, peering down into the valleys, shading their eyes against the bright morning sun. Then Shukin pointed. "There," he said briefly. Shigeru followed the direction of his pointing finger and grunted. Horace, standing several meters away from the edge, tried to crane his neck and see what they were looking at, but his view was obstructed. Shukin noticed and called to him. "Come closer, O-san. It's quite safe." Shigeru smiled at his cousin. "Shouldn't that be Kurokuma?" Shukin smiled in return. "Of course. Come closer, Kurokuma. It's quite safe." Horace shuffled closer to the edge, instinctively keeping his weight leaning back away from the drop. Bitter experience in the past had taught him that, even though he hated being in high places, he was paradoxically drawn towards the edge when he stood on one, as if he found the drop irresistible. "Quite safe my foot," he muttered to himself. "And what is this Kurokuma you all keep calling me?" "It's a term of great respect," Shigeru told him. "Great respect," Shukin echoed. Horace looked from one to the other. There was no sign on either face that they were joking. Very well, he said, continuing to shuffle forward. Then, looking in the direction Shukin indicated, he forgot all about his hatred of heights and terms of great respect. Across the vast valley, toiling up the trail that clung to a mountainside opposite them, he could make out a long column of men. The sun glinted haphazardly from their equipment as they moved, and the light caught on helmets, spear points, and swords. Arasaka, Shukin said. He looked from the column of tiny figures to the crest of the mountain they were climbing, then across the next series of ridges. He's closer than I'd hoped. Are you sure? Horace asked. It could be Reito and the survivors of the royal army. But Shigeru shook his head. There are too many of them, he said, and besides, Reito-san should be closer to us. How far away are they, do you think? Horace asked. Even though he had been riding through this countryside, he had no idea how fast a large party could cover ground, and he had no real idea what lay between Arasaka's army and themselves. Maybe 4 days behind us, Shigeru estimated, but Shukin shook his head. Closer to 3, he said. We're going to have to move faster if we want to reach Rankoshi before they catch us. That's if we can find Rankoshi, Horace said. So far, nobody seems to know where it is. Shukin met his gaze levelly. We'll find it, he said firmly. We have to find it, or we have no chance at all. Eyagi-san was confident that there would be people in Riverbank Village who would know about it. Some of the older folk in particular, he said. Well, we're not getting any closer to it standing here talking, Horace said, and Shukin grinned appreciatively. Well said, Kurokuma. Horace tilted his head and regarded the Senshi leader. I think I prefer that to Osan, he said. I'm not absolutely certain, mind you. It's a term of great respect, Shukin told him. Great respect, Shigeru confirmed. Horace's gaze switched back and forth between them. That's what makes me uncertain about it. Shigeru grinned and slapped him on the shoulder. Let's get back to the horses. As you say, we're not getting any closer to Riverside Village while we stand here talking. They reached the village in another 2 hours. As they rode in, a familiar figure strode out from one of the cabins to greet them. Horace recognized Reito, the Senshi who had brought them the news of Arasaka's rebellion. He glanced around the village and became aware that there were other Senshi there, the survivors from Shigeru's army in Ito. Many of them were injured, with blood-stained bandages on their wounds. Some were moving around the village, often limping heavily. But too many of them were lying still on rough stretchers and litters. He heard Shukin heave a deep sigh. We're going to be moving a lot more slowly from now on, the Senshi leader said.